One thing that I've always really loved about horror media is its marketing. As a genre that is designed to provoke primal instincts like fear and anxiety, horror posters and cover art tend to be a lot more visceral than your average comedy or drama, as they tap into our gut anxieties through subtle and not so subtle outlandish imagery. With few series being more emblematic of this than the Silent Hill franchise. As a semi-surreal psychological horror series, its covers have always had a certain creative license to them, being far moodier and more expressive than most of what you would see at your local EB Games, with a level of direct emotional rawness that you rarely see in commercial art. It's also a super cool series for box art, as with literally every game in the franchise, there's a unique piece of art for each region. And so I wanted to rank and review all of them. And I'll be doing this by sorting them into this highly original tier list system that I just spontaneously created by myself for this video. And by doing this, I hope that I can get to the core of what makes for a good Silent Hill cover. Or at least, good according to me. Generally, I'll be judging each piece of art based on these core factors. And I don't think there's a more natural game to start with than the three pieces of artwork representing the original Silent Hill are cool because they all present a very different vision of what Silent Hill is. Though, of the three, I think the Japanese version is the weakest, which I can assure you will not be becoming a trend. This one is the most minimalist, with the creepiness I believe supposed to be coming from the ambiguity of it. It depicts what looks like bloodstains on a hospital wall, yet the pattern doesn't really resemble blood splatters. Rather, they almost seem to form letters. But no matter how long you look at it, it never really comes together into something discernible. It's a very covert approach, but I honestly just don't find it to be that creepy. It is solid and it does match the aesthetic of the first game, but I think there are others that take this same approach but do it more effectively. It just doesn't give me the willies, so in my opinion, C tier. Then you have the equally iconic American and European covers, each showing a very different side of this game. To me, the North American cover perfectly represents the light world. The haunting feeling you get wandering the empty, foggy streets of Silent Hill alone. It just captures the emotion of the story perfectly. The confused desperation Harry experiences trying to find Cheryl, overshadowed by the dark essence of the town. Faces blend together and nothing is clear. While it does look a hair dated due to the CGI models, it still looks a million times better than a lot of the computer-generated art from this era. It sells the game perfectly, and I think it rightly deserves a spot in A tier. The PAL cover also perfectly encapsulates Silent Hill, but a very different side of it. To me, this art represents the nightmare world, the disturbing brutality of the game that lies beneath the surface, and also the great sadness, showing Alessa in a horrific post-ritual state with her skin badly burnt. It's probably the most direct and openly ugly of all the covers, but is still tame enough to be displayed on shelves, showing a great level of restraint. I think it lands an equal spot next to the North American cover in A tier. Jumping forward because I don't want to go through all of the best games first, Downpour shows us that even when the games got kind of bad, the covers were still there holding it down. That is, unless you're in North America, which, thankfully, is the single only time the series succumbed to the dreadfully generic main protagonist with a weapon trope. That trend that our market just can't seem to get enough of. I mean, for what it is, it's not terrible. I like how the rain is illustrated, it's cool how it slices through the title, but overall it's just kinda lame and looks more like an action game than anything else. So, as a matter of principle, it lands in F tier. Then you have the Euro title, which, yeah, is a big step up. It's a very well composed image. I really like this cool, mysterious postman in the background. It's a nice nod to The Exorcist. However, that aside, I gotta admit, I'm pretty biased against this one. I really just don't like that face. The prisoner is an enemy that to me just feels like such an Arkham Asylum reject. Like something straight from some edgy Joker fan art. I don't know, it just doesn't feel Silent Hill-esque to me and it kinda ruins the mood. So, sorry, but C tier. It's not you, Downpour, it's me. Now, if you really want to see the good stuff though, the Japanese got you covered. This one is really cool. Probably a lot cooler than Downpour honestly deserves. It's one that seems to be pretty clearly drawing off of Francis Bacon, which makes sense as he was always a big inspiration for the series. One thing I also really love about this one is how, despite not explicitly featuring rain, it manages to evoke it through its cold, misty color palette and long, downward brushstrokes. It's equal parts mysterious and abrasive. It even being unclear as to whether the subject is meant to be a straight-up monster or a greatly suffering human, if not both. Making it as alienating as a good Silent Hill cover should be. The artist brought their A game and created a cover that lands in A tier. Now here we have three pretty similar covers, all of which feature the locked door of the titular room, yet each one goes for a different vibe. And something I can assure you is becoming a trend, is North America getting saddled with the worst cover, with its box art kinda speaking for itself. The 3D monster head just doesn't really mesh well with the rest of the mostly flat image, and the whole thing looks overlayered and messy. It's one of the few that are more technically incompetent than they are artistically incompetent. But hey, at least they tried. D tier. On the flip side, I think the best of these is the Japanese cover, which is basically just the North American one done right. The spooky ghost face here is flat and meshes with the door far better as a result. It's also just appropriately more spooky and insidious than the aggressive looking monster head, which I think is more befitting the feel of the game. I also like how the locked apartment door is more of a focal point, because really that's the scariest part of the game. Waking up to suddenly find yourself chained in and trapped in your own apartment. It's an inherently creepy concept and this cover sells it perfectly. A tier. And the same can kinda be said about the European cover, but it can't help but feel like wasted potential. Showing the door just by itself, but with this very gratuitous blowout effect. Like, I get what they were going for graphically, but I just don't like it. It's ugly. I feel it would have been a lot cooler had they gone for something more subdued and literally just showed the locked door, as I think it alone is suggestive and mysterious enough to be haunting. But I guess they didn't think that was compelling enough, and maybe they were right, but still, nuking the cover with light wasn't the answer. C tier. Now, Homecoming is unique in that it's the only game in the series that didn't release in Japan. And honestly, this is also the only mainline game that I myself have never touched and know very little about. And so this is the one instance in which the covers are all I have to go off of. And, they're not bad. Like, there is decent intrigue for me in the American cover, as whenever I see this cover I do honestly think, who is this kid and what's his deal? And so I would say that this makes it an effective piece of marketing, but then again, I still never cared enough to play the game, so. But it is a good cover. I don't think I'll put it too high, as it does feel a little bit static and isn't quite surreal enough for my tastes, but I'd say a solid B tier. And while the PAL cover is definitely a lot more dynamic, it also borders on being a little too busy in my opinion. Granted, out of all the covers that use that very iconic rusty color palette, this one is probably the most vibrant, and I really like that. I also like the amount of grit and texture on display here, even though it does feel a little bit overloaded and the framing is weirdly imbalanced. But my main issue is just I'm kind of unclear as to what it is it's trying to depict, and not unclear in an intriguing or spooky way. Like, why is this nurse sitting in an armchair for? Is this guy walking into the same room as her, or is he walking outside? I find it to be very visually appealing, but I just don't really know what to make of it. So, high C tier. Out of all the Origin covers, the Japanese is definitely the most unique of the three, really being unlike any other in this collection. And you know what? It kinda slaps. This is a super cool and expertly illustrated image of Alessa on the cusp of something crazy. It's pretty wicked. There's just one problem. It ain't spooky. Really, there's not much that jumps out as horror in this cover, reading more as action game starring telekinetic orphan girl than anything else. It just doesn't really match the game's feel or aesthetic, so while it is exceptional on a technical level, for these reasons I can't in good conscience put it anywhere higher than B. Next you have the North American cover, which is one that treads dangerously close into main protagonist with a weapon territory, but not completely. The darkened figure of Alessa is still there to remind you that this is in fact a horror game. I just wish Travis's beefy forearm wasn't there ruining the mood. Oh wait, it isn't, as the Euro cover just straight up removes him, and instantly made the cover better for it. You know what? It actually feels a little empty now. Well, this one is appropriately enigmatic. It is a little basic. Like, this is probably as prototypical a Silent Hill cover as you can get. Granted, I do like how the excess negative space is being used as a tool to communicate a sense of isolation, but I think it just feels slightly too minimalist for me. Despite featuring badass protagonist man, the American cover does honestly make me want to play the game, even if the EU version is more tonally appropriate. So while good taste tells me that PAL should be in B and NA should be in C, my gut is telling me that they both deserve a spot in B. And you know, I gotta go with my gut. Now, at the beginning, I said that each game here had a unique cover for each region, and while that is technically true, Shattered Memories here is stretching that truth pretty thin. Because as you can see, all three showcase the same freezing ghost girl on a swing, but there are subtle differences between them, and the only way we can spot them is through cross-reference. Once again, the North American and Euro covers are the most similar, and again, North America screws it up the most blatantly. For one thing, there's the gratuitous IGN and GameSpot endorsement, honestly just really working hard to kill the vibe. It's also just not very well put together. Swing Girl looks like a PNG that was just slapped onto a couple of generic background layers. Something the Euro cover improves upon by lessening the perceived contrast between the foreground and background. Also, while it too has its own endorsement, there isn't a logo and it presents the quote in a game-appropriate font. It also just makes the cover darker as a whole and better draws out the cold colors. But it still looks a little bit cheap to me. The Japanese cover, on the other hand, while technically the most well put together, with a natural blend of foreground and background elements, I think loses a lot of the character that the Western covers had, as it presents Cheryl as a sort of generic ghost girl, which sucks as I think the Ice version is not only more disturbing, but also far more distinct. It also better helped represent the game's central ice motif. But again, they just aren't quite as well put together. So, unfortunately, while I think the European cover is the best of the bunch, I can't put either higher than C, while North America continues to tarnish our name by landing in D, the weakest lineup so far. And really, despite being one of the classic original trilogy games, I can't say that I'm overly crazy about the Silent Hill 3 covers either. The Euro cover, for example, while not bad by any stretch, is a little unremarkable. It's just a picture of Heather with that sort of David Fincher-esque grain filter that was so popular in the early 2000s layered over top, which I find to be a little bit overly simple and predictable. I also find it odd that they tried to make Heather look creepy, which feels unbefitting a character that the player is meant to relate to. Granted, I do like how underneath the noise and darkness, you can still get a glimpse into her eyes, so it still has a bit of a sympathetic feel and prevents the cover from being totally creepy and alienating. So, points off for oversimplicity, but I would still say high C tier. Meanwhile, NA is going full low effort, showing off probably the most unremarkable cover yet. Honestly, It speaks for itself, and it doesn't have anything interesting to say. F tier. So that only leaves us with the Japanese cover. And hey, it's really good. And it does technically fall into the protagonist with a gun trap, but it works because unlike the Downfall cover, it's not using that format as a way to make Heather look badass or empowered. On the contrary, the fact that she's packing heat really makes her seem more desperate than anything, which is driven home by her unsure expression and posture. So it still feels like a cover to a survival horror game, and it is very visually appealing. It's well proportioned, I like the giant 3 in the corner, I even like the vaguely monster-like appendages in the top left. But it's not quite as surreal or ominous as I think it could have been. I've always gotten the sense that Konami really wanted to push Heather as a marketable character, and fair enough, she's probably my favorite aspect of the game. Still, the fact that they focus on her made this seem a little bit tame and not quite A-tier material in my eyes. But now we're at the one that everyone either universally hates or ignores. This game was very clearly just a mediocre cash-in, and it makes you wonder, how good could a cover for this game possibly be? Box art is ultimately a reflection of the game it's promoting, and if the game is as shallow as this, it's going to be difficult to find any deeper meaning or emotion in the cover art. Take the American cover for example. It's perfectly suitable, it's not offensive, it is what it is. It's a game about a spooky book. A simple boring cover for a simple boring game. D tier. And while the Japanese cover is certainly more exciting, the same problem is present. I mean, I'll always take a denser, more action-filled image over something static when it comes to action games. But again, it's just kind of a dumb image because a dungeon crawler Silent Hill game is kind of a dumb idea. So honest as it may be, enticing it is not. High D tier. In fact, it's the lack of honesty that makes the European cover the most memorable. It's honestly technically very strong. It doesn't exactly scream Silent Hill outside of the palette, and it makes the game look a lot moodier than it actually is, but it does look compelling, like a very well produced indie adventure game. They did the best they could with what they were given, and they turned out something pretty solid. B tier, the highest placement this game probably could have gotten. Now, if you were paying attention, you'd notice that this left only one game remaining. But there are a few side projects I want to bring up as well. First of all, despite being the dumpster fire that it was, the Silent Hill HD collection actually came out swinging with a pretty good cover. Considering how many HD collections then and now just have the old box art smushed together onto the front, I think it's really cool that here they created an original piece of artwork to help sell the game instead. A digital illustration that feels a bit more modern than anything Team Silent created, but one that still matched the tone and feeling of their original work. Extra effort goes a long way, and in this case it goes towards B tier. And you know, I really don't want to get into the movie posters because there are a million of them and that's a very dense can of worms that I don't want to get into, but this official poster for the 2006 movie is really cool. I remember being freaked out by it at Blockbuster when I was 9, so well done marketing team. It gets a prestigious honorary mention. And come on, you know this list wouldn't be complete if I didn't bring up PT. Now I know this game may never have been an officially sanctioned Silent Hill game, but it's part of its history now and there's no getting around it. And this teaser image kicks ass, even though it really shouldn't. It's just a picture of a tree stump in a forest. But honestly, this image just really creeps me out, and I couldn't tell you why. Maybe it's just projection, but there's just something very subtly spooky about it. I don't know, I can just see that sun is setting and I don't want to be alone in this forest in the dark. It reminds me of this time when I was in Sapporo, Japan a few years back, and went alone to this empty, isolated Shinto shrine in the woods on the outskirts of the city. I remember it was around twilight, and inexplicably, I got this sudden knot in my stomach and this strong impulse to get out of there, like I was being watched. I just knew I didn't want to be there. And that's what this photo reminds me of. A sudden but unexplainable feeling of unease. A tier. And now, For completionist status, let's speed run through all the covers that were too obscure to get a real ranking. But now we're at the grand champion of the series, the undeniable GOAT. Silent Hill 2 is sort of the inverse of Book of Memories, in that hypothetically it doesn't matter how basic a cover it gets, because the game itself is such a deeply and emotionally resonant game that anything would automatically have a great deal of potent weight to it just by association. But luckily that's not all they're working with, as these are consistently high quality covers. First you have the European release, which is probably the most thematically appropriate. Silent Hill 2 is about James' hopeless search for his wife, and this cover really captures the sense of mystery around Silent Hill 2, and the game's hauntingly elusive feel. It hints at the heavy and intimate nature of the story via this glimpse into Mary's eyes, but with the surrounding black space, it predominantly feels very cold and impersonal, like the town her spirit is trapped in. It really captures a very distinct side of this game's tone. So, classic A tier. The Japanese cover, on the other hand, takes that impersonal element and commits to it fully, creating something that replicates the very cold and imposing side of the game. The moments spent entirely alone in the depths of James' psyche. To me, this is a far more successful take on the approach we saw on the Japanese cover of 1, as it is ambiguous but also very ominous in a way that I don't find the first one to be. It's also one of the few covers that uses specific imagery that'll only be recognizable to those who have played the game, and I really like that. While it may not be as catchy for someone who hasn't played it, to fans it holds a lot more weight. And I think the devs knew that this was a game that was going to stick with people and be replayed over the decades. And that it did. Another A tier. But finally, the North American cover. And for as much shit as I have thrown at this region throughout this video, ultimately they got the best and most iconic cover in this series. One that, more than any other, captures what Silent Hill is really meant to be about. A cloudy, hopeless spiral into the madness of the mind, but one tinged with a very sad, melancholic beauty to it. Out of all the Silent Hill covers, this is the one that feels the most intimate, showing a close-up of Angela in a moment of almost off-putting vulnerability. Something that is almost creepy and voyeuristic, but also weirdly soothing. As if, although we may be lost in our madness, in this moment we can take comfort in the fact that we're not alone in it. It's both unsettling but also cathartic, and a perfect example of the emotional directness that makes dramatic horror such a compelling genre. S tier, no questions asked. So yeah, Silent Hill covers are great.